I'm Ian Pritchett. I'm a director of Ssassy Property and also Greencore Construction. And in the time I've got available, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of background. I've been in the construction industry for 30 years. So the first 20 years of that was running a company repairing historic buildings. And through that, I gained an appreciation of traditional building materials and their inherent sustainability. So in 2002, I started another company called Lime Technology, which initially was promoting lime mortar for new buildings. And we supplied lime mortar to all sorts of buildings like St Pancras Station, schools, universities, hospitals, offices and things. And then we were involved with developing and promoting another material which was based on lime and hemp called hempcrete. And we promoted and sold that into all sorts of affordable housing projects and private housing projects of all shapes and sizes and non-domestic buildings, such as here we've got the Heritage Skills Centre at Lincoln Castle on the left and the Centre for Alternative Technologies, WISE building on the right. And the reason we did all of that was because we made the connection between buildings and climate change many years ago. It was really through working on windmills and watermills in the early 2000s, studying weather patterns to plan work on windmills. I realized that our climate was changing and that our CO2 emissions were one of the major factors. Prior to that, I'd been a bit of a skeptic, but when you start to look at the facts, you can't ignore it. And we're seeing subtle changes, but incremental changes where we're seeing more and more extreme events happening more and more frequently. So last year, for example, we saw the hottest day on record in this country. Last winter, we saw in Australia, we had bushfires that were incredibly severe and some of the worst ever. And those were immediately followed by flash floods. So there's some pretty major extreme weather events going on around the world. And as David Attenborough says, what we do in the next 10 years will profoundly impact the next few thousand. We are emitting CO2 at an unsustainable rate, and the climate is warming up as a result of that. So in this country, we've got a piece of legislation called the Climate Change Act, which sets out a roadmap to be nearly zero carbon by 2050. But the climate science is saying that we need to go faster. And it's now generally agreed that we need to reduce our CO2 emissions by 50% in the next decade, hence David Attenborough's comments. And actually, 50% of the UK's CO2 emissions come from either the construction or use of buildings. So that's the use of our existing residential, commercial, industrial buildings and the construction of all our new buildings as well. So the construction industry probably can do more than almost any other industry to help us reduce CO2 emissions. And we think when it comes to new buildings, the elephant in the room is this thing called embodied carbon. When we construct a new house, we use materials that are all processed to a greater or lesser extent. And during that processing, they emit CO2 emissions. And if you look at what the average emissions are in the construction of a new house, it's somewhere around 50 to 60 tons of CO2. And that's what's known as its carbon footprint. That's its embodied carbon. So all the emissions from the production, transport and installation of all the components of the house. And then when that house is finished, it's going to emit something like another 5 tons a year in use. So a new house that's built this year in 2020 will be responsible for 200 tons of CO2 by 2050, and 2050 being the target when we're supposed to be zero carbon. So in Oxfordshire, we've got 100,000 new houses planned. That's going to be responsible for 20 million tons of CO2 emissions just between now and 2050. And that's not sustainable. We cannot keep building houses that are adding to the problem. Legislation is beginning to talk about zero carbon houses, but when most people talk about zero carbon, what they mean is zero operational emissions. So that 5 tons a year is being reduced to zero or reduced as much as possible and offset in some way. But we actually need to tackle the embodied carbon as well as the operational carbon, because remember, the operational The embodied carbon is equivalent to 10 to 12 years of operational emissions. So there's this thing called carbon capture and storage. All of the climate models at the moment that are predicting temperature changes over the next decade or two are all assuming that we're able to have some sort of degree of carbon capture and storage. But the technologies don't really exist at scale at the moment, and certainly not economically. So this idea of being able to suck up CO2 out of industrial processes and pump it underground is still very small scale and very expensive at the moment. Good news is that we've got a natural carbon capture and storage facility, and that's plants and trees. So all bio-based materials lock up carbon dioxide. And that's because plants absorb CO2 and then they use the energy from the sun and the chlorophyll in the leaves in a process called photosynthesis, and they turn that CO2 into cellulose. And if you go through the maths and the chemistry, it actually takes 1.8 kilos of CO2 to make 1 kilo of cellulose. And that's because the plant breaks down the CO2, the oxygen is given back to the atmosphere, and the carbon is locked up in the cellulose. So we are entering what some people are referring to as the age of wood. This is an article from the New Scientist, and on the right you've got a skyscraper in Chicago being planned to be built out of wood. The more wood we use in buildings and the more plant-based materials we use in buildings, the more carbon we can lock up. This is a multi-storey building in South London near Elephant and Castle that's being constructed in the last couple of years using cross-laminated timber. And that's a mass timber product that's very strong, good insulator, and locks up lots of carbon. At Greencore, and this is a Ssassy project as well, we build all of our houses out of timber and hemp and natural fibre insulations. So the more bio-based materials we can incorporate into buildings, the more carbon we lock up. And therefore the choices that we make in the design and the construction of the houses determine its carbon footprint, its thermal performance, its aesthetics, all sorts of things become determined by those choices. And if we make the right choices, we can build houses that have a zero carbon footprint and zero emissions in use. And it's taken us a few years, but we are now at that point where we can do that. And we started by doing single houses and then going to small groups. And then we moved on to this project here at Longcott in Oxfordshire for 15 houses. Our client was Oxford Advanced Living, which is a group of investors who buy into what we do. They bought the land and commissioned us to build the houses. And it was 6 affordable houses and 9 open market houses. It's now finished. The affordable houses are inhabited. The open market houses are for sale. And these have a near zero carbon footprint, passive house performance, so they use very little energy for heating. And it's been certified by Bioregional as a One Planet Living scheme, and it's achieved national leadership status. We learnt a lot in doing that project, and we have taken that learning to the project we're doing at the moment for Ssassy Property at Springfield Meadows in Southmoor, which is 25 houses. And we've been able to stretch the boundaries a little bit further. We're doing near zero carbon footprint, passive house thermal performance, but we're also doing net zero energy in use. So we've calculated all the energy these houses will use per year, and we've put enough photovoltaic panels on the roof to generate the same amount of energy each year. And then we've got an electric car club and a car sharing scheme, a partnership with the Wildlife Trust to advise on and monitor all of the landscape and public open spaces. And this project has been recognised by Bioregional as a One Planet Living global leadership project. So our mission at Greencore, or our purpose at Greencore, is to accelerate the global transition to low carbon living. Our mission is to scale up the delivery of low carbon homes until they can no longer be ignored by the mainstream house builders. How many do we need to build to stop being ignored? And then our vision is to lead by example and change the construction industry forever. We've learned a lot from the projects we've done so far, and we now know that we can build houses that have zero or very close to zero carbon footprints and emissions. But we've also learned that we can come at it from a different direction. everything we've done so far has been about trying to minimize the negative impact on the environment. But we've now started to look at it from the other perspective and say, what if we could create a positive impact on the environment every time we built a house? So we have climate positive houses. And the definition of a climate positive house is one that locks up more carbon than it emits at the construction stage, generates more energy than it uses, is in a context that increases wildlife and biodiversity. And if we build enough of these, they can be a catalyst for local food schemes and green transport networks and things. And we're working with a local community energy scheme to make neighbouring villages net zero energy. So when we build, say, 200 houses on the edge of a village, we can put enough PVs alongside them to not just make the houses zero energy, but to make the neighbouring village zero energy as well. So that's what we refer to as climate positive housing. And we launched a plan back in January to deliver 500 climate positive houses by the end of 2025. We've set up a company to do land promotion, and we're working with landowners on taking some sites through the planning process at the moment. And we'll be putting applications in over the next few months on some of these schemes. We also want to build a green business park in Oxfordshire so that we can attract like-minded businesses to the area. Oxfordshire has signed up as a county council, and the district councils and the city council, they've signed up with Bioregional to make Oxfordshire the first one planet county in the world. And at the moment, something like 7% of Oxfordshire's GDP comes from the clean tech, low carbon, green sector. And we think we can increase that. It's currently the biggest, fastest growing sector in the economy. And so we want to build this business park to support the businesses that will be involved in building these climate positive houses. And we want all these to be stunning, stylish buildings. Here's a couple that we were involved in building previously. The one on the left is the Adnams Brewery Warehouse and Distribution Centre in Suffolk. So it's a 50,000 square foot warehouse, an office for 120 people. And the warehouse is temperature controlled, but it's got no heating or cooling. It's entirely passively done. Saves about 100,000 a year in energy bills. And then the Marks and Spencer's store on the right-hand side is at Cheshire Oaks in Ellesmere Port, built out of hemp panels that we manufactured and installed. And this building uses only 40% of the heating energy that it was predicted to use when it was designed. So we can be doing these buildings in Oxfordshire. We can create a green business park, support 500 climate positive houses, and it's all part of the transition to One Planet Oxfordshire. So there are various ways that you can help if you're minded to get involved. Do you know a landowner who has suitable land and wants to leave a legacy that they're proud of? Do you know an investor or investors who want to make a positive social impact as well as a profit? And do you have the skills, products or services needed to get involved? The two projects I've presented at Longcott and Springfield Meadows were both where we found the land, we found the investors, we put the whole thing together as a project, and then we designed and built it and delivered it. So if you're minded to follow up and get in touch, you can visit our website at greencoreconstruction.co.uk or email me on inquiries@greencoreconstruction.co.uk.